Welcome to the 386th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today, I welcome Dolly Jorgensen, environmental humanities scholar and author of Recovering Lost Species in the Modern Age, Histories of Longing and Belonging. Just a reminder, you can usually catch COVID Calls live on weekdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. This is a special COVID Calls at 5:30 p.m. Korea time. You can hear COVID Calls anytime recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID Calls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. And as always, please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, December 8th, 2021, there are 5,270,625 deaths from COVID-19 globally. That's according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. I've been reading an obituary or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic, and I'd like to continue that now. Headline is Shelby County art teacher Gold Coach legacy lives on after COVID-19 death. This was written by Michael Collins and appears on the Who We Lost website, whowelost.org. And this is actually from the whowelostkentucky.org site. This appeared December 4th, 2021. Matt, Mr. C. Cockrell was not a typical high school teacher. It made sense that the halls around his class and the art wing of Martha Lane Collins High School weren't typical either. The walls are painted with student-designed work led by Cockrell for years before he passed away from a month-long battle with COVID-19 on September 19th, 2021. He just started taking his kids out to the hall and painting, current Martha Lane Collins principal Nate Jebsen said. I don't think he had permission from the previous principal. Eventually, they got the right permission and just kept expanding and expanding. Cockrell and his students designed murals depicting abstract shapes, landscape scenes, original characters, and school insignia. He wanted his class to be unlike anything he had growing up, Jebsen said. His classes were very much loud, a lot of people talking, but everyone is engaged in their work and he's just going around checking and coaching them through. His skills and teaching philosophy earned him the 2019 Secondary Level Art Educator of the Year award from the Kentucky Art Education Association. That's a pretty big stinking deal, but he wasn't one to tout that unnecessarily, Jebsen said. He was just always pushing the limits of what could be done in class. Cockrell organized an art show in February 2020 at Science Hill in Shelbyville, Kentucky, for students to showcase their art to the community. Gracie Scroggum, a 2021 high school graduate and former student of Cockrell, said the show was a fun opportunity to connect with her classmates and that Cockrell never made art feel like work. A lot of the time, some art teacher is just like, okay, trace your hand and paint it. But he actually had more in-depth assignments for us to do, and I really enjoyed that, Scroggum said. Cockrell often combined his love of national parks into assignments, allowing the students to recreate pictures he had taken while visiting parks during summers. Scroggum painted several pieces based on Cockrell's pictures over the 3 years he taught her. I have a watercolor painting on the wall of my dorm from his class, Scroggum said. I put it up after I heard about him passing away because I enjoyed painting that picture so much. Pieces from Cockrell's class were highlighted by the National Parks Conservation Association in June 2019 for educating students about environmental protection through art. I loved being able to look through all those pictures and talk to him about national parks and stuff like that, Scroggum said. C wasn't Cockrell's only nickname. Coach C took over when he stepped onto the green to lead the Martha Lane Collins High School girls golf team. Riley Sutter, a 2019 high school graduate and former Lady Titan golfer, said Cockrell contributed greatly to her success through high school. He really boosted my spirits when I was down on the golf course or had a bad hole, Sutter said. Golf is so mental. You have to be in a happy mood all the time, and I think he really did that for all of his players in high school. Sutter said what stood out about Cockrell was his ability to stay happy even during difficult times. He was very happy all the time. I don't think I've ever seen Coach C really down, Sutter said. I think even when he had COVID, he was always happy and always looking out for others. Sutter said Cockrell was the kind of person who would want others to use his passing as a time of personal growth and remembrance. I would think he would want people to reflect and have a good mood, Sutter said. I look at his passing not as a good thing, but we can learn from his experiences and move forward. The headline was Shelby County art teacher, gold coach, legacy lives on after COVID-19 death. You can find this and other similar obituaries on the whowelostkentucky.org website or the whowelost.org website. And my guest to talk about this project was in my previous episode of COVID Calls, episode number 385 with Martha Greenwald. Be sure to check that out. Okay, I'd like to turn to my conversation today. This is one I've really been looking forward to with great excitement. Let me introduce my guest, Dolly Jorgensen. Dolly Jorgensen is professor of history at the University of Stavanger, Norway, specializing in histories of environment and technology. Her current research agenda focuses on cultural histories of animal extinction, and she recently published Recovering Lost Species in the Modern Age, Histories of Longing and Belonging, which appeared with the MIT Press in 2019. She's also the co-editor-in-chief of the journal Environmental Humanities, and she co-directs the Greenhouse Environmental Humanities program area at the University of Stavanger, and many other projects as well, which I'm sure we'll talk about. Dolly Jorgensen, thank you so much for joining me on COVID Calls.
Thanks for having me on, Scott.
So I'd like to start the way I generally do, just find out where you're calling from and what the COVID situation looks like there.
Absolutely. So I'm calling to you from Norway. I live in Stavanger, which is on the southwestern side of Norway. Norway, just to give you a little bit of information as you think about COVID situation, we have a total population of about 5.4 million people in Norway. And we've actually so far managed the outbreak very well. Our total number of deaths is just under 1,100 for the entire pandemic. But at the moment, positive test rates have been going up in line with both Delta and then now Omicron. Whereas we were 5% positive at the beginning of October of people taking tests, you're up to 18% now, much of that being driven by school kids. So that has become a problem in terms of schools not having enough teachers to teach the kids because you end up in quarantine. Vaccinations are good here in Norway. Not great. I mean, we could be better. But for 18 and older, 92% have one dose and 88% have two doses. However, kids under 16 or 16, under 16 are only allowed to have one dose right now, which as a parent is a bit concerning to me. Luckily, one of my children who's high risk has actually gotten a second dose, but that's unusual. Yesterday, we just had new restrictions come into play because of Omicron, and that'll take effect tomorrow. So limited number of guests in the home to 10, limited guests at official activities, 20 or 50, depending on like seat configurations, except children's activities. They're actually really trying to make sure that children's activities continue to happen. Although, as I just said, children are the ones that appear to be driving, so There's some political things going on there. Um, they with the restrictions, they've also come a little harder on masks. That's not been a normal thing here in Norway. Um, and they've re-recommended work from home where possible.
Hmm.
So we'll see how things go over the winter.
Oh, thank you for that overview. And in terms of your own teaching, I mean, were you all remote there most of last year, or were you back in the classroom given the relatively low infection rate compared to your neighboring countries?
Absolutely. So we were back in the classroom. Um, we had gone into the real lockdown at the very beginning, right? March through May of 2020, schools were closed. But actually, at the end of May, schools reopened. The university went to online teaching in that period. But then we went back into the classroom. There's been some hybrid, so particularly the large classes, so big lecture halls, we're not allowed to seat the number of students that were normally seated. So many of them went to having either smaller groups and you had to do the lecture more than once, or having digital sends for the lectures. But I was actually teaching primarily smaller groups at the master's level, so 20 students. So my class was in person, just in a big room. So the students were a bit spread out. Um, that's basically how we've been doing things here.
And the philosophy of keeping the younger children in school and prioritizing that over everything else, is that an extension of a sort of educational philosophy in Norway that would prioritize that over other things? How do you account for that?
Yeah, I mean that's really been obvious throughout, that the priority has been to have kids in the classroom, to allow children's activities, so sports that were with kids,
Hmm.
whereas sports that were with adults were canceled. Um, so other after school activities, being in choir or dance or drama, is allowed for kids, and they've kept that throughout. So it has been an intentional decision to try and, I think, manage stress among kids, to keep life as well normal
Hmm.
as possible in all of this. There were some restrictions that were put into place at different times, like how many kids you could invite over for your birthday party, um, or restricting it to just your own class. So that came to be kind of the norm, not mixing groups, but that's been the way they've approached it all along.
It's quite impressive that that low number of deaths. I mean, I'm here in South Korea where the number is under 4,000 for a country of 52 million. It's impressive, and I know what they've had to do to make that work. Some of your not too far away neighbors there, including Sweden and the UK and the Netherlands, have not fared nearly so well. Has that created some kind of regional tensions in terms of border policing, or keeping track? I think particularly early during Delta, I wonder, were there moments there when Norway was keeping its borders a little bit more tightly controlled, or did that never play?
Yeah, I mean, Norway did shut its borders in January. Luckily, we'd just gotten in a couple of researchers that were starting postdocs from elsewhere. So we were very
You
glad that we actually
you
got them in
used
the
your
country.
political influence there, didn't you, Dolly?
Yeah, well, so it did shut down.
Hmm.
And then right at summertime, it opened back up for those people who had been fully vaccinated, and had EU documentation for it. That's actually where it still stands now. So it's somewhat problematic, particularly in the academic sector, where we collaborate with people from across the world, that if you don't have an EU compatible COVID certificate showing your vaccination, you're technically not allowed in the country. So it does create this kind of regional bubble.
Hmm.
and make it quite difficult to bring people from elsewhere. So we've had to, when we had a new hire in August, we actually had to work really hard to get special permission to bring her in from the US because of these restrictions. It, at the same time, because we allow anybody who has the EU compatible certificate to come in, then it doesn't matter that they come from the UK, where there's really high incidence
Right.
of COVID. They're still allowed to come in.
Hmm.
But at the same time, we have looked at our neighbors a little, wondering what they were doing, particularly Sweden,
Right.
which we would have thought would have ended up the same, and yet they have 10 times the rate of Norway.
So, thanks for tolerating all these questions about Norway. You're my first guest I've had on in
Yeah.
386 episodes from Norway, so I really appreciate getting this information. Let me ask you if you could share a memory of this time, something that really stands in your memory as what this COVID period has been like for you. Can you pull out a moment that might represent?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Well, I think what kind of sticks with me is not a specific one individual moment, but actually the fact that we started going on more regular walks as a
Mm,
family.
yeah.
Because yeah, to get outside, because we were doing home office because the kids weren't going to school at the very beginning. I mean, they were online, but they weren't going, and so we started doing walks, and that was really, I think, a great way to get outside, to be in nature, to improve your health, and to just be together
Mm,
in a different way. So it struck me that we did that under COVID.
mm,
I guess the other thing, and that kind of relates to my work in animals, is that we were home because we were working from home at a time when my oldest dog got ill and or declined, such that we were home with him for 3 months and
mm,
then had to put him down.
mm.
Um, and that was actually really special, to get to be with him every day and not just leave to go to work and then come
Right,
home and see him in the evening.
right. Thank you for sharing both of those, and I'm sorry about your dog, and what an interesting insight to have had that time. Because really, I mean, I think a lot of us have this with our families in general, and with pets. You get a little burst of time in the morning and burst of time in the evening, and during the day, you're sort of wondering what everybody's doing.
Right.
But so,
Exactly. So that was a yeah, that was really nice. And of course,
mm,
with COVID, what you see with pets is that there was a huge kind of pet boom of people buying new dogs and even chickens. And a lot of that had to do with, well, being with somebody, and having somebody to look after and look after you. As much as we take care of our pets take care of us, especially mentally. So yeah, so I think a lot of people were feeling that way with COVID.
so were you tracking that from pretty early on? I mean, I remember stories, different kinds of stories. Some of them were kind of rough stories about like the lockdown in Wuhan and people abandoning, like trying to get out of the city ahead of the pandemic. Maybe those stories were sensationalized. I haven't seen much follow-up reporting, but abandoned pets when people left home. But then the follow-up coming early in the pandemic of people either reconnecting with pets, as you described, or um, welcoming new pets into their households. You tracking that? And if you were, how do you keep up with stories like that?
Well, I was paying attention to those kind of stories. I mean, one of the things that interested me was when Italy went into their full lockdown. So in late February, um, and in 2020, and basically told people you couldn't go anywhere except to the grocery store, right, or to the pharmacy or the hospital. Those are the only places you were allowed to go. You had to stay in your house. But an exception was made, specifically for walking your dog. So that was the thing you could do, was to walk a pet. Um, and so that struck me as how integrated then our pet culture is into, how we understand our lives. So here were all these restrictions, but realizing that, well, but this is necessary. It was a necessary thing for the dogs to be able to go out, and have their walk, just as, people need to go out, because often with the restrictions, then you said, oh, well, you could go for a walk of so far away from your house. um, and and so that was when I got kind of really interested in thinking about, um, that human animal relationship under COVID. Actually, was one of the earliest things that caught my attention, was how that was allowed when other things were not allowed.
I wonder, where do you think that springs from? Is it I mean, it seems totally sensible, and from, like, an emergency management point of view, you would think it's also, like, how you might help people maintain positive mental health in the middle of a disaster. It's also maybe kind of a policing issue, like, maybe that's the kind of rule people are just not gonna follow if you say you can't be out with your animals. I wonder about that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that happened was some people started walking weird things that shouldn't be walked, because they were allowed to walk them. So you had a couple of stories that were like, "Oh, I was out walking my pet bird," and it's like, your bird didn't need to go for a walk, right? And somebody was walking their pet turtle, you know. Um, so it's funny how humans can abuse the rules. But I think it comes from, I mean, pets are integrated from particularly early modern period. You have this development of household pets. So of pets that live as companions rather than as working animals. Um, and it, and in that, they've become part of the family, in Europe, at least in Europe, culturally, in most of Europe. So that's where it springs from, I think. And this thinking about animal welfare, which is a very strong current, in many countries here, in terms of, you don't want them to be abused. And so walking them is seen as part of a welfare requirement.
Hmm, that's really fascinating, and I know, actually, one of the very first COVID calls I ever did was with, sociologist Sarah DeYoung at the University of Delaware, and she's a specialist in evacuation, and it's one of the major issues with emergency management planning of evacuation is that people are going to bring their animals to the shelter, and so if you don't plan for it, I mean, it's going to happen whether or not you want them to do it, and of course, that means dogs are going to fight in the shelter. Maybe if you haven't, there's a million things that go into that kind of planning. But I don't know how much planning had been done for the inverse, which was not an evacuation but a lockdown. Do you have a
Mm.
sense that governments had any sort of guidance along these lines?
I actually I don't. So I don't get a sense that they had planned for such a thing. So it is interesting then to think about what they came up with as
Hmm.
as the things you could and couldn't do, and that was somehow on the list of the acceptable things to do. So where that came from, I honestly don't know. It would be an interesting project for somebody to look at and see, was it a particular minister, had some animal welfare, or they actually had a pet and they thought of this, or did it come from some group, who pointed it out that this needed to happen? Because you're right. In fact, there's right now, it just came out a couple days ago, a big hoopla in the UK about, the Afghan withdrawal, and one of the people taking their dogs. with them in the withdrawal, and whether or not that was an appropriate use of governmental resources to
Right.
take the dogs over, I guess, over a person.
Right. Right. So that's maybe that. So we got the space of the household in terms of pets. Now let's talk about some of the other spaces where we might be encountering animals and discussion of animals during the pandemic. So maybe zoos or other kinds of wildlife facilities where people go and experience wildlife, but not in the wild, but in the controlled setting. What happened with
So
zoos?
yeah, I mean, zoos have been a really interesting case, because when you closed everything down in March 2020, and they closed their doors, then there were no more visitors to zoos. So a lot of zoos actually came out pretty quickly and said, we have financial problems, because we don't have any guests, any ticket income, and yet we need to be able to feed our animals. Our animals don't quit eating, and that's the major expense at a zoo, is actually keeping animals fed. So it was. I remember that the Neumünster Zoo in Germany, the director made a comment that said, "Well, if we have to stay closed for too long and the government doesn't give us support, we're going to have to start feeding the animals to each other." And people were just like outraged that one would say this, but at a certain point you do actually, you I mean, you would have to put them down. You'd have to kill them for animal welfare reasons if you don't have any money. So some governments have given support then to zoos when they were closed as kind of cultural institutions. um, so there was that, and when they were closed, then some zoos came up with some interesting things. But my parents live in San Antonio, Texas, and their zoo had a drive-through. So you would take your car and drive on the sidewalks and see the animals. My favorite, though, was the Sumida Aquarium in Japan, who were worried that, or supposedly, that we're worried that some little eels that they have. So these are little eels that stick out of the sand. You've maybe seen them at aquaria.
Hmm.
They stick their heads out, and so they kind of look like a little stick. We're getting afraid of people because they were not seeing people. So usually there were lots of visitors at the aquarium or would pass
Hmm.
by, and now when their keeper went in, they would all disappear because
Oh,
they got scared from people. So they decided to have an online eel show festival, and they got people to call in a Zoom call, and they put monitors up around the tank of the eels so that the eels could see people coming. And so millions of people called in this eel show. Whether or not it really works, I don't know. Could the
yeah.
eels even see the screen? I mean, one of my dogs can't see the screen at all, so I don't know. But uh, but it was creative in any case, and if I ever go, I'd love to go to Sumida Aquarium just because of that and see their eels. Um, so there were kind of the visitor issues with
Mm.
zoos that were disrupted. But the other thing that's happened is that it turns out that SARS-CoV-2 can infect lots of different animals
Right.
and not just humans, right?
Right.
So, um, just in November, 3 snow leopards in Lincoln, Nebraska died from COVID. The Singapore Zoo, right now, a couple days ago, I saw an article that 5 of their lions are positive. The hippos at Antwerp Zoo in Belgium have COVID. Um, so some zoos have gotten, of course, I mean, there's one you need to take care of these animals. Some of them are symptomatic, some are not. I
Hmm.
mean, obviously the 3 snow leopards, they actually, it appears cats can get COVID and have really negative. Versus the hippos, it sounds like they aren't too bad off, kind of a cold. Um, but some zoos have been giving vaccines now
Really?
particularly to their primates, because since primates, humans being the same, um, they've been very afraid of gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans getting COVID and ending up with the same kind of disease as humans would have, the same kind of reactions. So that's kind of ongoing. Now, what this means, I mean, it's really interesting because I don't think it's clear, these zoo animals, where they're getting the COVID from.
Well, that's what I
You know,
was
is
going
it,
to ask you. Is it
yeah, is
passage
it
from
from their
humans to, I didn't know it could
keepers?
jump species like that.
Yeah, so is it from their keepers? Is it
Hmm.
from the public just visiting? Is it on things that they somehow come in contact with?
Hmm.
That has not been studied so far, at least as far as I know. Um, what's what it means though is that if COVID can jump to these species and be there, of course it means it can jump back often.
Right.
Um, so you're creating a permeable layer between humans and animals with the disease, and in so doing, you can end up, of course, with different variants
Right.
also that develop. This is what's concerning about a recent article. It's actually a preprint study, so it's not been vetted yet. But there's a preprint study, Kuchipudi is the last name at all, which found that 1/3 of the white-tailed deer in Ohio that they sampled were positive
Really?
for SARS-CoV-2. Now, what's worrying about that then is that hunters have regular contact with those white-tailed deer as a prey that you hunt for pleasure. And so if it's endemic, if it's become endemic in the deer population, then every fall when the hunters go out to hunt the white-tailed deer,
Right.
they will be in contact with those animals. And in fact, they're in bodily contact with those animals, right? Because there's actually blood, there's actually
Right.
organs that you're contacting, which is a perfect kind of, situation to be passing things. Um, so so the question, where did the white-tailed deer get it? Again, maybe they got it from hunters, but now will they be giving it back to hunters? So this kind of wild populations, I mean, if we think about the beginning of COVID, all the speculations about which wild animal it had come from. Was it from bats? There were ideas it might be from pangolins.
Hmm.
You know, the point is that obviously it does jump between species. It's not just a human thing.
But
And
yeah, it jumps, and also but what you're describing is significantly complicates what has been, I think, too often kind of an exotic narrative also, that this is just something that happens only in China. It's humans and bats, or maybe humans and pangolins coming into contact, and because of these practices of, the wet markets and that kind of thing. It's quite different when you describe hunters in Ohio coming into contact with white-tailed deer. Um, I don't know, culturally, what the broader impact of that might be, but it's something that's pretty distressing to think about, both at an epidemiological level and at a cultural level. There was something else I wanted to ask you before about the animals in the zoos, particularly. What are the ethics of that? I mean, what are the ethical? I mean, the ethical responsibility of people to not kill animals is a pretty problematic area to start with. But in a zoo, you expect. I mean, it's a space where you expect some pretty clear regulations and rules about care of the animals. So, what are the ethical concerns about allowing humans in who might actually sicken the animals?
oh, that's really interesting, because I don't think that has previously been talked about within the ethics, as far as keeping the animals safe from something a human might carry to them. I mean, Yes, their welfare and concern is there's a lot of regulations and standards. I mean, very specific things too. I mean, I was looking at something else for elephants. I mean, there's very specific regulations of how many hours an elephant can be at what temperature before they need to be, warmed up because you can't have elephants be too cold. And I mean, it's down to this temperature on the gauge for this many minutes before you need to take it in, and then it has to be in for so long. So animal welfare is a major issue. Of course, how that animal welfare is thought about is a bit different across the world, even though there are international standards. So, for example, in the US, zoos regularly give preventative medication for pregnancy to zoo animals. So they keep them from breeding, except if they want them to breed. So they take them off the medication if they want the animal to reproduce. Whereas in Europe, in most cases, they do not do that because it's understood as part of the animal's being, their way of being to reproduce. So it would be a diminishment of their welfare to not allow them to mate to then give birth. And so it's actually different philosophy in how you think about animal welfare. Um, but I haven't heard anything about this kind of disease control in terms of, visitors in this case, or keepers that are somehow infecting these animals. And I think it's probably because, as I said, I don't know if they know where it's really coming from.
Right.
And then one animal gets it, and then has passed it on, from animal to the others, in all likelihood.
Right.
So that's, yeah, but when they do get something, so when they do get a disease, if it's a debilitating disease and it appears that they're suffering and that there's no cure for it, in general, you will kill the animal. That's considered standard welfare practice within zoos. So the 3 snow leopards, I don't know, and I don't know if the zoo would say if they actually died, like they were so ill
Right.
that they died, or if they were going to die
Right.
and
Right.
they were put down. I'm not entirely sure. It wouldn't surprise me if it was the latter, in that it would be considered bad welfare if you let the animals suffer for something that you can't cure.
Let me just very quickly remind folks that you're listening to COVID Calls, and I'm talking today with Dolly Jorgensen, environmental humanities scholar and also the author of Recovering Lost Species in the Modern Age: Histories of Longing and Belonging. So I wanted to ask you about this book, and that we were chatting before we came on. Congrats on the book. I'm sorry for the timing of the book, and I really want people to get this book and read this book and talk about this book. And I wanted to ask you too how you see this work. So you're tracking 2 things. I mean, you're tracking extinction, but you're also tracking the sort of like how humans react to species loss and extinction, and the sort of emotional content of that too. So it's a multiple sort of entwined histories here. And I wonder how you see this work now in light of COVID, because there's been um, a lot of, I think, rethinking and maybe time to think. People, really talking about the concept of the anthropause and thinking about the Anthropocene, and um, you know a, a a global lockdown, collective human behavior. There's a lot of things that about the environment and thinking about the environment that people might have said was impossible before 2020, and now it's very much in discussion. And of course, one of those is extinction. I mean, I don't think anybody thinks COVID is going to. Well, I don't. Some might think this. We don't tend to think COVID is going to make human beings extinct, but
No.
early in the pandemic, it did conjure these sort of apocalyptic moments. And so I've been wanting to ask you this, how you think about the book now in light of what we've been through.
Yeah, thanks. Because the book looks at these, as you said, ways that people respond to when species have become either locally or even globally extinct, and how they emotionally connect with those animals, and then work to bring them back, and why they do that. And what I found is that it's because people have this sense that particular animals belong in particular places, and that when they are gone, or belong in their lives, in fact, and when they're gone, they long for them to come back. So there's this feeling of loss, and of wanting it back, and then you're motivated. You can turn that into different emotions, as I look at in the book. So it can be that you're basically sad about it. It can be that you feel guilty for it. It can be that you're hopeful for a future. Um, and I think for me in the COVID situation, the lesson from the book is that emotions matter tremendously, in what we do and how we choose to respond to particular kinds of loss. So we could look at the losses of people in COVID and say, well, there are different emotional reactions to that that may lead to different choices, different ways of responding, whether you're going to be melancholic about it or angry, right? Will lead you to a different place. And so it's the same in my cases with loss of animals species, is that groups of people respond emotionally to that. It matters to them that that animal species is no longer there. They have an emotional connection. Um, and so I'm thinking about, for example, one of the things that happened with lockdown was that temples in Southeast Asia that have animal species that live there. So there's a lot of monkey temples, for example. So like temples in Thailand that have crab-eating macaques. There's temples where you have bird species, just pigeons, dogs, rats that are considered sacred in those temple spaces. And when all of a sudden people weren't there, those animals actually didn't have any of their regular food and gifts that were given. And so local people, though, felt emotionally attached to those um, animals that were in those temples. So they kind of started underground, and often at the beginning against regulations of, restrictions of where you were supposed to go, going to feed the animals that were in these temples.
Wow.
Because there's this feeling of emotional connection and a fear of loss of those things.
Hmm.
And so I think, rethinking my book means that it's not just about conservation actions, which are the things I was looking at, but rather more generally about our relationships to nature, and how we use our emotions to determine what we're going to do. And I guess one of my big messages in the book is that that's not illogical. That it's not to say, oh, well, you didn't use some science to
Right.
determine what your reaction should be. You were emotionally driven, and that's been thought of as somehow, well, that's not logical to do that. And I think it's precisely logical. It's logical as humans to be motivated by what we love or hate or miss, or so that's how I've been thinking about the book now.
It's so interesting, and I was thinking about this in light of that Nature piece. The COVID-19 lockdown allows researchers to quantify the effects of human activity on wildlife, which came out in June of 2020, in which that term, the anthropause, was put into circulation, and all of these. I mean, I think of out of the UK, the self-isolation bird club, and these, like, people really, the sort of really interesting conversations, which at first they were like, there's more animals are returning, animals are coming back into the cities, and there's some, film people had of certain
Right.
animals appearing downtown.
Absolutely.
That's definitely happening, I guess, to a certain degree. But the inverse of that was people saying, no, the animals have been here. It's just you were at work, and so but what was really happening, and this is where I take your point about emotions, is that people were writing and talking a lot about how great it felt to hear a bird sing or to see an animal that they might have thought, they wouldn't even thought it was extinct or had just been depopulated from an area. They just didn't think about it.
Exactly. Exactly. So I think what the whole anthropause idea, I don't think it lasts, if you will. I think we had an immediate lockdown, and people were off the streets, people were in their homes, and yes, they were paying attention to different things. So that's why you get kind of this backyard bird
Mhm.
paying attention. You could hear birds singing in a different way because there weren't as much other noise. Car traffic was down. But of course, it's all back now. So it was a
Right.
very short pause in that way. I don't think it would have a long-term effect on the animal behaviors or animal populations. Um, but it did cause some people to at least notice that nature was there around them. As you're saying, it's not that it wasn't there. It's actually they just never bothered to notice that it was there, and that non-humans actually inhabit our cities.
Mhm.
And we just don't pay attention to them. So yeah, so from that perspective, it's maybe good that some people started to pay attention, started to notice them, but we'll see how much of an effect that really has in the long term, or is it just back to status quo and again the cars and again not noticing what's in
Yeah,
your own backyard.
right, and I guess that was my question, and I agree with you. I mean, the anthropause was not long enough probably to change, species density in certain areas, but maybe it was long enough to change the way that humans think about non-human species, and that's sort of my question. I've been puzzling over this and trying to think of the historical, like, is there anything we can pull from history to help us with this question? And thinking about war maybe as a time in which there's just massive disruption to where species are, and then after war is over, there's some sort of period of renormalization, and maybe people reconnect with seasonal patterns or migration of animals or whatever it may be. But I've been sort of grasping for something. But I mean,
Mm.
given your research, I wonder if you've encountered this, where there were other times historically where people sort of have written about, oh, we're connecting with the animals around us that we hadn't connected with before.
I mean, not really.
Hmm.
But the one example that does come to mind is, well, thinking about how a crisis affects a particular animal population and then responding to that would be the European bison, in that um, the last European bison that were free living had died during World War I. And
Mm.
so it was seen as a kind of response to that travesty, to work to develop a breeding program for European bison, because there were some in zoos, which they did. And now there are wild bison again, but they all come from these zoo animals.
Right.
Um, but that was a case where, yeah, it was a disaster. It was a disaster for these animals, and then you kind of took the opportunity to bring them back from the brink. So that's a connection, if you will, but it wasn't a connection that like normal people made. It was a connection that some particular scientists and zoo directors and people like that were making. Um, because you're right. I mean, maybe war is the closest thing that one could think about. You know, how would you respond in France, you know, after the destruction in World War II? So did people like say, "Oh, look, the animals are back"? And I honestly don't know if that's been because there's been some books that deal specifically with war periods, but this kind of regular people's post
Hmm.
traumatic experience and connection. I don't know of work that's done that.
So, just a quick reminder that I'm talking with Dolly Jorgensen today on COVID calls, and among the many things that she does, she also curates a web-based project called Remembering. Well, I think it's only web-based. I'm not sure. Remembering Extinction, and you can find this on her website. And I want to just read a couple of sentences from the description of this project. One of the things, by the way, Dolly Jorgensen is a great follow on Twitter, and one of the reasons is that you go to museums and then you write about what you see, which has
Yeah.
also been great during the pandemic. So, for those of us who have not been in too many museums, but here's from the description: you say greater input is urgently needed from arts and humanities to work alongside, as well as to critically engage with the scientific discoveries and ethical imperatives of contemporary wildlife conservation studies. You go on, museums, art galleries, and other public spaces are primary sites of public engagement with conservation issues, including extinction, critical reflection on how they can be used to cultivate heritage thinking about non-human species is timely. And I wanted to ask you about this project, and so we've been talking mostly at sort of about academic projects now, but I think sort of public history, public science institutions are ones that you also do a lot of work with and work about. So tell me more about this project.
Yeah, so it is actually a project that's beyond the web. I had a postdoc, and I have a PhD student who work on this with me. And I have some collaborators in the UK and in Poland that also had academics and postdocs and artists. So we've been looking at, yeah, how museums tell stories of extinction. How might they tell stories of extinction that happened, extinction averted, and what communication modes are best to talk about those things, including the arts, as well as standard kind of natural history discourses in museums. And yeah, so I visit a lot of museums, and I'm interested then in how extinct things are put on display, and what kinds of stories get put with those, and how we talk about them, and how we might be able to make people think differently about extinction. You know, realize how present it is in the world right now, how present it is in their lives. Because it becomes very abstract, right? What do I do about orangutans in Sumatra?
Right.
So, but trying to make it more real, if you will, in these. So one of the things that's actually COVID related was I co-authored an article in the wake of the lockdown with my postdoc Verity Burke and Finn-Arne Jorgensen, who's also a scholar of environment and technology, about museum responses to COVID, and the ways in which museums were able to move into digital spaces.
Hmm.
And were they able to? I mean, you know, you had to be pretty nimble as an institution, and not all were very nimble in that. Um, but a couple of interesting things out of that research were that um, you have opportunities to make online exhibits and engage people with uh, topics in different ways than you used to be able to. I mean, we have a lot of technology now, so people don't have to just go to museums in person in order to get this kind of environmental or nature theme that we were interested in. And that people want to engage with collections. So
Hmm.
I did the work with looking at how museums like, for example, the Getty Museum Challenge brought people together very quickly to make comments and new versions of Getty artworks.
Hmm.
And the ways in which people, thousands, hundreds of tens of thousands of people, if not even to 100,000 people, involved in producing copies of these works from things they had at home. So they're engaging with museum collections and making it their own. And to me, that's what was really important about the Black opera singer Peter Brathwaite, Brathwaite, yeah, who was, I think, one of the most creative and leaders of this in taking artworks that
Right.
had Black subjects and then making it his own today and reinterpreting it. And so to me, that's the kind of thing that we have an opportunity, even with nature, to also do, to have people think about museum collections and specimens in their own lives and how they interpret them. And digital means are excellent to do that because they can reach into your houses, they can reach into the schools, far away from where the actual museums are.
Yeah, I was so happy to find this article, Museums at Home: Digital Initiatives in Response to COVID-19, and it's actually available open access. People can find it. The journal is Norsk Museum Tidskrift,
Yes.
which I'm sure I'm not saying correctly, but I'm trying.
No, that was
Uh,
good.
and you can find it. I put the title up here, Museums at Home, and as you mentioned, it's co-authored by yourself, Verity Burke, and I'm really glad to hear you name check Finn-Arga Jorgensen. So, but this project, I mean, you point out in the article, so you kind of go through different kinds of ways that museums are coping with all the stuff. Just as we were talking about zoos, everybody's at home, and so it falls into a few different categories. One is maybe the one you would think of first, the virtual museum tour. So, we're gonna walk you around the museum, and I think those already sort of existed to a certain degree, various levels of sophistication. But then also sort of live museum events. So still having events at museums, just without people, so you can watch something that's happening in the space. But the other one, which you were just alluding to, is just like crowdsourcing the content, and so that's happening in conjunction with the Black Lives Matter movement. And to me, I think so those two in the United States, but not only in the United States, obviously, become indistinguishable as moments of reckoning. And I've been fascinated to see how museums are trying to grapple with that. And let's layer onto that this issue of, as you were talking about extinction or climate change, Anthropocene, whatever you want to call it, the broader environmental context in which a global pandemic like this is possible. So the three of those together, it's a lot to take on for any museum. But I've been very impressed by the kinds of things I've seen museums try to do in this moment.
Yeah, I am as well. I think there's a number of them that are doing collections, collection drives, having so for example here in the lockdown period we had a kind of a movement, alt blir bra, so it's all going to be okay, if you will,
Hmm.
as the saying. And kids made little signs and flags and things to hang in their windows. So there have been some kind of collection drives for those kind of artifacts in different countries and different contexts. Um, and and yeah, that then trying to create communities in spite of not being open, because particularly museums run on a very tight budget generally.
Sure.
So they actually need the visitor numbers, both direct income from ticket sales, but also to show why they're valuable and why the state should support them as
Mhm.
institutions. And so it's been very challenging for them. So they've, in trying to do things like online communities and online events, um, and I've been active in several of them. We mentioned an article about the Silver Linings book that we wrote as part of an exhibition on clouds in art and science, and that had to go digital. There was another event I was involved in that was on oil, that was in connection with an art exhibit, that was a hybrid event. So there were a few people in the room, but most of the people were not.
Mm.
They called in from all over the world. So I think museums are trying to make that kind of move and really, yeah, stretch out the audience and participation. So the one event in the oil case had people from all over the world, artists presenting and
Hmm.
talking about their artworks.
Hmm. One of the things you point out in the article is, I'm quoting here, visiting such a cross section of museums, as we were talking about before, offers fresh insight into digital tourism
Mhm.
in the age of coronavirus. And my question in reading that was, what are the implications beyond? And maybe tying it back to the sort of the mainstream of your work too. If natural science museums, natural history museums in the older sense, have been struggling. I'm thinking of Philadelphia and the Academy of Natural Sciences there, sort of legendary institution, been there 200 years. And they've struggled, frankly, in the last 20 years to get people in the door. It's not what you would choose to lock down because of a pandemic, but I think it did force them, as you have discovered, into all kinds of new ways of trying to engage with audiences. Is that something that we can imagine going forward out of this time, or do you think these museums are going to be eager to get back to just doing the kind of bricks and mortar things they were doing?
No, I think they're really going to continue with the kind of digital initiatives, digitizing collections, making exhibitions that are online. So even if you have an in-person component, making more robust online components. Um, I mean, people have had kind of online exhibits for a long time, but really making those much fuller experiences, I think is going to continue to happen. I think one of the things they realized is you can get to a much broader audience that's beyond your immediate vicinity, right? Your immediate region or immediate city by doing such things. Um, and so I see that, I mean, digitization was already on the way up. I think this only spurred it on as a further movement within the museum sector. And so we'll see how it translates long term in terms of exhibitions or access to materials. I mean, that continues to grow.
Mm.
Um, Lockdowns don't help necessarily move it forward, because as much as we think, oh, well, everything should be online, but if your archivists and natural history biologists can't go in to see their specimens because they can't go into their office, then they can't digitize them either.
Right.
So the, there is that problem of access. So they've ended up, I think, in many ways behind on their schedules that they should have been digitizing, simply because of the disruptions
Right.
of work. I mean, I know this happened to me. I was trying to find some archival material about a Caribbean monk seal, which is an extinct species, and from the Smithsonian. And because there's a notebook there that had some photographs. And in emailing the archivist, they originally replied and said, "Well, we're closed. I mean, we can't go in to get you the copy of this,
Mm,
page that you'd like to have, but we'll do it as soon as we can."
right.
And so 3 or 4 weeks later,
Then you
they're
got
able
it.
to actually go into the office and get it. And so it was great, and I really appreciated it. But it does mean that, you could see that they're also frustrated in their ability to get to the things that they have in their storerooms and in their archives, because of restrictions, due
Right.
to COVID.
Yeah, and the people I've talked to in the museum sector, they enjoy this kind of conversation, but they always bring me back to the point. They're like, "Yeah, we'd like to do all those things, but the problem is our budgets have been cut, and we're worried that they won't be restored after the pandemic is over." So we have all this evidence that people want to engage with museums from their homes or from wherever they are, but will that be compelling enough to government funders and private foundations and everybody else who needs to pay to make these things happen? That's an open question, I guess.
Absolutely, absolutely. That this is the issue is, you worry that because they had fewer people coming in the door than they when they make their annual reports and say, "Oh, how did it go in 2021?" and there's, a significant drop, that then the funders will say, "Oh, well, then you don't need money." And they're already on edge. Um, so let's hope that people who are in those decision making positions listen to conversations like this and say, "Oh yeah, okay, people
Yeah.
actually want to engage, digitally with this material. They want to engage at a distance. We need to keep having activities, um, but those can be hybrid activities, for example, to open up the publics." But
Right.
yeah, it all comes down to money.
So we're almost up on time in our conversation. I've actually been a little greedy with your time here today, but I figured I might be. Was so looking forward to talking about these issues with you. And just last question as we're closing out is really, what's coming up next? I won't say when the pandemic is over because I'm not using that kind of framing anymore. But what's your next book project, Dolly?
Well, I'm currently working on a book about this extinction in museums.
Hmm?
I was lucky enough to get to do two trips this fall. One in which I went to Poland and the Netherlands, and one that I went to Boston and New York, um, for the book. To be able to see some more museum exhibits. I still have a list of things because, of course, I couldn't do anything in 2020 and the yeah 2/3 of 2021. So I have a list of places to go see. So I'm hoping, you know, one never knows. You can't make plans very early for travel. But so that's the plan is to finish this book on extinction in museums, which is currently titled "Ghosts Behind Glass:
Hmm.
Encountering Extinction in Museums," and finish that up. And then my next project, which has actually just begun, and I'll be hiring a couple postdocs and a PhD student on, is called Histories of Animals, Technological Infrastructure, and the Making of More Than Human Homes. And that is about how animals inhabit infrastructure that humans build,
Wow.
and whether that's intentional or not intentional, and how we respond to that. So this COVID interest, I think, will continue on in that project and thinking about how animals live around us, and either we want them or we don't.
I know at least one graduate student here at KAIST who I'm going to want to, as immediately as soon as possible, send up your way to spend some time with you and learn more about this project. It's this more than human research in the context of the Anthropocene is really catching right now, and I think that the with COVID, for the many reasons we talked about, the anthropause and then the inverse of that, the sort of discovery of species, is an interesting sort of set of questions alongside what the Anthropocene portends, which is human domination to the detriment of the other species that we live with and among. So I can't wait to hear more about that project. And good luck with it. And as I said earlier, following you on Twitter, I think I was following your trip to Poland because I think you were posting pictures from
Yes,
museum visits there. So,
right, exactly.
okay. Well, I just want to remind everybody you can usually catch COVID calls at 6 p.m. Eastern time. Today is for me, it's been a two a day COVID calls day starting this morning, and this one special one at 5:30 p.m. Korea time. And I want to thank my guest, Dolly Jorgensen, who is the author most recently of Recovering Lost Species in the Modern Age, Histories of Longing and Belonging. Dolly, thanks for your time and for this great conversation.
Thanks for having me on, Scott.
Stay healthy, everybody. We'll see you next time on COVID Calls.